Welcome back to Horror Vault Channel. In this video, I will share with you the 5 chilling yet true garage sale horror stories that have already happened in different parts of the world. I would highly recommend you to first subscribe to Horror Vault Channel if you haven't done so already. Then you will be the first one to get notifications of our latest true horror story videos. Okay, let us now begin with the first spooky true horror story. Story 1. The Hound's Fury. It was supposed to be a quiet Saturday. I had been walking through the neighborhood with my coffee in hand, enjoying the crisp morning air, when I stumbled upon a garage sale a few blocks from my house. The setup was modest. Just a few tables covered with old books, trinkets, and household items. A young woman, Emily, stood behind one of the tables, chatting with neighbors as her small dog barked intermittently from where it was tied to a post nearby. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but something about the scene drew me in. Maybe it was the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting from Emily's thermos, or the cheerful banter of people haggling over prices. It felt like a slice of normalcy in an otherwise mundane week. But normalcy has a way of unraveling when you least expect it. As I browsed through a box of old vinyl records, I noticed him. A large dog, maybe part Mastiff or Shepherd mix, trotting down the street without a leash. Its coat was dark and matted, and its eyes darted nervously as if it were searching for something or someone. I recognized the dog immediately. It belonged to Mr. Grayson, an older man who lived 2 streets over. He usually kept it in his backyard or walked it on a sturdy leash, but today it seemed to have escaped. At first, the dog's presence didn't alarm anyone. It sniffed around the tables, wagging its tail as if it were just another curious shopper. But then its demeanor shifted. Its tail stiffened, and its ears flattened against its head as its gaze locked onto Emily's small dog, a yappy little terrier that had been barking nonstop since the big dog arrived. The tension in the air was palpable. Before anyone could react, the large dog lunged toward the terrier, snapping its teeth and growling ferociously. Emily screamed and rushed to untie her dog, scooping it into her arms just as the larger dog reached them. The terrier yelped and squirmed as Emily tried to shield it with her body. "Get back!" someone shouted, but no one dared to intervene directly. The large dog circled Emily like a predator, stalking its prey, barking and lunging at her legs. She stumbled backward into one of the tables, sending books and knickknacks crashing to the ground. That's when Mark, one of the neighbors browsing nearby, stepped forward with a folding chair in hand. "Hey, get out of here," he yelled, swinging the chair at the big dog to scare it off. But instead of retreating, the dog turned on Mark with terrifying speed. It clamped its jaws around his leg and dragged him to the ground as he screamed in pain. Blood seeped through his jeans as he kicked desperately at the animal's face, trying to free himself from its grip. The scene descended into chaos. People scattered in all directions, some screaming for help, others frozen in shock as they watched Mark struggle beneath the weight of the snarling beast. Someone threw a rock at the dog. Another neighbor swung a broomstick at it, but nothing seemed to faze it. Emily stood paralyzed near her overturned table, clutching her trembling terrier as tears streamed down her face. "Somebody do something!" she cried out desperately. Finally, Mr. Grayson came sprinting down the street, shouting the dog's name, Rex. He carried a leash in one hand and waved frantically with the other as he approached the scene. "Rex! Stop! Heel!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with panic. To everyone's relief and astonishment, the dog released Mark and backed away slightly at Mr. Grayson's command. But its eyes still burned with aggression as it growled lowly at anyone who dared come near it again. Mark lay on the ground clutching his bleeding leg while paramedics arrived to tend to his injuries. The police showed up shortly after that, questioning witnesses and taking statements from everyone who had seen what happened, including me. Mr. Grayson apologized profusely to everyone present, swearing that Rex had never behaved like this before, and insisting that it must have been provoked by something or someone. But no one believed him. The once bustling garage sale now felt like a crime scene. Tables overturned, broken glass littering the driveway, bloodstains marking where Mark had fallen. Emily packed up what little remained of her belongings without saying another word, and I couldn't blame her. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rex's snarling face looming over me, heard Mark's agonized screams echoing in my ears, felt Emily's terror radiating through every fiber of my being. But what haunted me most wasn't just what had happened. It was what hadn't happened yet. Because deep down I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. In the days following the attack, strange things began happening around our neighborhood. Late at night, I'd hear scratching noises outside my window, like claws raking against wood. Trash cans would be knocked over mysteriously, even ones too heavy for raccoons or stray cats. And worst of all, I started seeing glowing eyes watching me from shadows whenever I walked home after dark. At first I thought maybe Rex had escaped again, but every time I checked with Mr. Grayson, he assured me Rex was safely locked up inside his house. Or so he claimed. One night, after hearing those same eerie scratches outside my door yet again, I finally decided enough was enough. Armed with nothing but flashlight and baseball bat, I crept outside determined to find out once and for all what, or who, was behind these disturbances. But when beam landed familiar pair glowing yellow eyes staring back from bushes across street, it wasn't just fear-gripped heart. It pure unadulterated dread. Because standing there wasn't just any ordinary stray animal. It was Rex. Story 2. Strange Craigslist buyer. I've always been a fan of finding hidden treasures in my garage. Over the years, I'd accumulated a collection of old tools, some vintage, some still in good condition, that I no longer needed. My wife, Sarah, had been nagging me to clear out the clutter for months, so I finally decided to list them on Craigslist. I figured it would be an easy way to make some extra cash while getting rid of things I didn't use anymore. The ad went live on a Wednesday evening. Within an hour, I received a message from someone named Mike. He seemed eager, asking detailed questions about the tools and their condition. His messages were polite but persistent, and he was quick to negotiate the price down. I wasn't thrilled about selling the lot for less than I'd hoped, but I agreed to meet him the next day at noon. Thanks. Looking forward to it, he wrote in his final message. Something about his enthusiasm struck me as odd, but I brushed it off. After all, it was just a Craigslist sale. What could go wrong? The next day, Mike showed up right on time. He drove an old pickup truck that looked like it had seen better days. He was tall and lanky, with thinning hair and a nervous energy that made him fidget constantly. His clothes were worn but clean, a plaid shirt tucked into faded jeans. "Hey there," he said with a wide grin as he stepped out of the truck. "You must be Daniel." "That's me," I replied, extending a hand. He shook it briefly before turning his attention to the tools laid out on my driveway. "Man, you weren't kidding. These are great," he said, running his fingers over the handles of a set of wrenches. I watched as he inspected each item carefully, muttering to himself about their quality and usefulness. After about 10 minutes, he nodded and said, "All right, I'll take them." We loaded the tools into his truck together, and he handed me the cash, exactly what we'd agreed upon. As he climbed back into his vehicle, he gave me one last smile that lingered just a little too long. "Thanks again," he said. "You've got some really nice stuff here." "No problem," I replied, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. That should have been the end of it. But later that night, as Sarah and I were sitting down for dinner, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hey Daniel, it's Mike. Got any more tools you're looking to sell?" I frowned at the message. It wasn't unusual for buyers to ask about additional items, but something about his tone felt off. "Nope, that's all I had," I replied curtly. His response came almost immediately. "All right, let me know if you find anything else." I didn't reply. Over the next few days, strange things started happening around our house. It began with small things. Tools that had been left in the garage were suddenly out of place or missing altogether. At first, I thought maybe Sarah had moved them while cleaning, or that I'd misplaced them myself. But then one night, as we were getting ready for bed, Sarah froze by the window. "Daniel," she whispered urgently, "there's someone outside." I rushed over and peered through the curtains. Standing at the edge of our driveway was a figure, tall and thin, just barely visible in the dim light from the street lamp. "It's probably just a neighbor," I said quickly, trying to reassure her and myself. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I found fresh footprints in the dirt outside our garage door, large ones that didn't match mine or Sarah's shoes. Panic set in as I realized whoever had been outside last night had gotten dangerously close to our home. I decided to install security cameras around the property that same day. That evening after work, as I reviewed footage from earlier in the day to test the camera's functionality, my blood ran cold. There he was, Mike, standing in broad daylight at the edge of our yard near one of the camera's blind spots. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there with his hands in his pockets and staring at our house like he was waiting for something or someone. I called Sarah into the room and showed her the footage. "That's him," she said immediately. "That's the guy you sold those tools to." I nodded grimly and picked up my phone to call the police. The officers who arrived took our report seriously, but admitted there wasn't much they could do without evidence of a crime being committed. They promised extra patrols in our neighborhood and advised us to keep our doors locked and stay vigilant. That night was one of the longest nights of my life. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every shadow outside seemed sinister. At around 3 a.m., just as exhaustion began to overtake my fear, there was a loud crash from downstairs. I grabbed a baseball bat from under our bed and crept down the stairs as quietly as possible, while Sarah stayed behind with her phone ready to call 911 if needed. When I reached the bottom step, there he was, in my living room, rummaging through drawers like he owned the place. "Hey!" I shouted instinctively before realizing how dangerous confronting him might be, but it was too late now. Mike spun around startled, but instead of running away like any sane person caught breaking into someone else's home might do, he smiled. That same unnerving smile from before, and took slow, deliberate steps toward me, saying calmly, "You shouldn't have sold those tools. They weren't yours. They're mine now. You understand?" Story 3. Texas Garage Sale Stalker. It was a warm spring morning in 2018, and I had decided to host a garage sale in front of my small, suburban home in Fort Worth, Texas. My garage was overflowing with things I no longer needed. Old furniture, books, clothes, and a collection of knickknacks I'd accumulated over the years. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to declutter and make a little extra cash. By 10 a.m., my driveway was bustling with neighbors and strangers alike, browsing through the tables I had carefully arranged. The atmosphere was cheerful, filled with the sound of polite haggling and laughter. It felt good to be part of the community for once instead of hiding behind my closed doors. But as the morning wore on, something began to feel off. I first noticed him around 11:30 a.m. He was tall, average build, wearing a faded blue baseball cap and sunglasses that reflected the sunlight so brightly I couldn't see his eyes. He hovered near the table of tools for what felt like an eternity, picking up items only to put them back down without saying a word. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, trying to sound friendly despite my unease. He turned toward me slowly, his lips curling into a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just looking," he said in a voice that was flat and emotionless. I nodded and walked away to help another customer, but I kept glancing back at him. Something about the way he moved, deliberate, calculated, sent shivers down my spine. As the crowd thinned out around noon, I noticed he was still there, lingering near the edge of my driveway. By then, most people had come and gone, leaving only a few stragglers browsing through what was left. I started packing up some unsold items, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. But instead of leaving, he moved closer, too close, and began asking odd questions about my house. "Do you live here alone?" he asked casually while holding up an old hammer from one of the tables. The question caught me off guard. "Why do you ask?" I replied cautiously, trying to mask my discomfort. He shrugged and set the hammer down without answering before wandering toward another table. My heart raced as I watched him out of the corner of my eye. Something wasn't right about this man, but I didn't want to cause a scene or overreact. At around 12:30 p.m., everyone else had left except for him. He stood in the middle of my driveway now, hands in his pockets, staring at me as I packed up the last few boxes. "The sale's over," I said firmly, trying to sound braver than I felt. "You should go." He didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and smiled again. That same unsettling smile that made my skin crawl. "You've got some nice stuff," he said softly before taking a step closer. "Mind if I take another look?" My throat went dry as panic set in. "No," I said sharply, backing away toward my garage door. "I think it's time for you to leave." For a moment, he just stood there, his expression unreadable behind those mirrored sunglasses. Then he reached down and picked up the hammer again, this time gripping it tightly in his hand. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because one of my neighbors came running out of their house just as a man started walking toward me with the hammer raised slightly at his side. "What's going on here?" My neighbor shouted from across the street, startling both me and the stranger. The man froze for a split second before lowering the hammer and stepping back into the shadows at the edge of my driveway. Without saying another word, he turned and walked away calmly as if nothing had happened, disappearing down the street before anyone could stop him or get a good look at his face. My neighbor stayed with me while we called the police to report what had happened, but by then it was too late. The man was long gone. The police took my statement and assured me they would patrol the area more frequently in case he came back, but they didn't seem hopeful about catching him without more information or evidence. Over the next few weeks, similar incidents were reported in nearby neighborhoods. Women hosting garage sales being stalked or harassed by an unknown man who always seemed to vanish without a trace before anyone could confront him. The stories were eerily similar to mine, too similar to be a coincidence. Months passed without any sign of him until one evening in late August when I saw his face again, or rather his silhouette, standing under a street lamp across from my house. He didn't say anything or make any threatening gestures. He just stood there watching me through my living room window as if daring me to come outside. I called 911 immediately, but by the time officers arrived, he was gone once again, leaving behind nothing but fear and unanswered questions. It wasn't until September that they finally caught him. A man named Mark Eldridge, who had been living out of his car and targeting women, hosting garage sales across Fort Worth for months. He was arrested after attempting another robbery in a neighborhood where residents had formed a community watch group specifically to catch him. When police searched his vehicle, they found stolen items from multiple robberies along with weapons, including hammers like the one he had picked up at my sale months earlier. Knowing he's behind bars has brought some relief, but it hasn't erased what happened or how it made me feel. I haven't hosted another garage sale since that day, and probably never will. But more than anything else, I've learned how important it is to trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right. Because sometimes those instincts are all that stand between you and someone like Mark Eldridge. Story 4. The Cult at the Garage Sale. I've always been drawn to garage sales in rural areas. There's something about the quiet countryside and the promise of hidden treasures that makes the long drive worth it. That's how I found myself on a winding dirt road one Saturday morning, following a hand-painted sign that read Church Group Sale, all welcome. The sign was weathered, its letters uneven, but it pointed toward a gravel driveway that led to a clearing surrounded by tall, swaying trees. I hesitated for a moment. The place looked isolated, too isolated, but curiosity got the better of me. I turned onto the driveway, my car crunching over gravel as I approached a cluster of tables set up in front of a small, weathered building. It looked more like an old barn than a church, with peeling paint and crooked shutters. A group of people stood near the tables, their heads turning in unison as I parked my car. I stepped out and gave them a polite wave. "Morning," I called out. They didn't respond immediately. Instead, they just stared at me with expressions that were hard to read. Neither friendly nor hostile, just blank. Finally, an older man with a long gray beard stepped forward. He wore a simple gray uniform that matched the others. Plain pants and a button-up shirt with no logos or designs. "Welcome," he said in a deep voice that carried across the clearing. "We're so glad you could join us." I forced a smile and walked toward the tables, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. The items for sale were an odd mix. Hand-carved wooden figurines, jars of preserves labeled in neat handwriting, stacks of old books with their titles scratched off. Everything looked homemade or heavily used, as if it had been passed down for generations. "Are you part of the church group?" I asked casually as I picked up one of the wooden figurines. A crude carving of what looked like a man kneeling. The older man nodded. "We're more than just a church," he said cryptically. "We're a community." I glanced at him, unsure how to respond. His eyes were piercing, almost too intense, and his smile never wavered. As I moved from table to table, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The other members of the group stayed close by, their movements synchronized in an almost unnatural way. They didn't speak much, just murmured among themselves or occasionally nodded in my direction. When I reached the last table, I noticed something strange. Several photographs laid out in neat rows. They were black and white and slightly faded, showing groups of people standing in front of what looked like this very building. But there was something off about them, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Are these old members of your church?" I asked. The older man appeared beside me so suddenly that I jumped. "Yes," he said softly. "They were part of our family." His choice of words sent a chill down my spine. I decided it was time to leave. "Well, thank you for letting me look around," I said quickly. "I should get going." The man's smile faltered for the first time. "So soon? We were hoping you'd stay for lunch." "Oh, I appreciate it. But I really need to get back home," I replied, taking a step toward my car. The group closed ranks slightly, their bodies forming an unspoken barrier between me and the driveway. "It's rare that we get visitors," the man said slowly. "We'd love for you to join us, just for a little while." My heart began to race as every instinct screamed at me to leave. "Maybe another time," I said firmly and started walking toward my car. That's when I noticed it. My back tire was flat. Panic set in as I crouched down to inspect it. The tire wasn't just flat. It had been slashed clean through. "Looks like you'll be staying after all," the older man said from behind me. I spun around to face him, my pulse pounding in my ears. The rest of the group had gathered behind him now, their expressions still eerily blank, but their presence undeniably menacing. "I'll call for help," I said quickly, pulling out my phone. "No signal out here," he replied calmly. He was right. The screen showed no bars at all. Before I could respond, another voice cut through the tension. A frail but firm voice coming from behind the group. "Let her go." An elderly woman stepped forward from the shadows near the building. She was hunched over but walked with purpose, her sharp eyes darting between me and the others. "This isn't what we do," she said sternly to the older man. He hesitated for a moment before stepping aside reluctantly. The group followed suit, parting just enough for me to make my way to my car. "Thank you," I whispered to her as I climbed into the driver's seat. She didn't respond, just gave me a look that seemed both sad and knowing. I started my car and drove away as fast as I could on 3 good tires and 1 shredded one. My hands shook on the steering wheel as adrenaline coursed through my veins. When I finally reached civilization, a gas station on the edge of town, I pulled over and called for roadside assistance. As I waited for them to arrive, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, or what might have happened if that woman hadn't intervened. Later that night, unable to sleep, I did some research on local churches in rural areas near where I'd been that day. What I found made my blood run cold. Reports of missing persons linked to isolated religious communities, groups described as cults by those who had escaped them, One article mentioned a particular group known for targeting lone travelers under the guise of hospitality, and their meeting place sounded eerily similar to where I'd been earlier that day. I don't go to rural garage sales anymore. In fact, I avoid anything that takes me too far from home these days, because no matter how much time passes or how safe I try to feel, I can't shake the memory of those blank faces watching me leave, or wonder how many others weren't so lucky. Story 5. The Hammer in the Shadows. It was a warm Sunday morning in late spring, and I had finally decided to clear out my garage. Years of accumulated clutter, old furniture, tools, books, and clothes, had turned the space into an unmanageable mess. Hosting a garage sale seemed like the perfect solution. By 10 a.m., my driveway was bustling with neighbors and strangers alike. Tables were covered with everything from vintage lamps to stacks of DVDs, and people wandered around, chatting and haggling over prices. It felt good to finally get rid of things I didn't need while making a little extra money. But as the morning wore on, something about the crowd began to unsettle me. I first noticed him around 11 a.m. A man in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing a faded Dodgers cap pulled low over his face. He lingered near the table of tools for what felt like an eternity, picking up items only to put them back down without saying a word. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, trying to sound friendly despite an uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. He looked up briefly, his expression blank. "Just browsing," he said flatly before turning his attention back to the tools. I nodded and walked away to help another customer, but I kept glancing back at him. Something about his presence felt off, like he didn't belong there. By noon, most of the crowd had thinned out, leaving only a few stragglers browsing through what remained. The man in the Dodgers cap was still there, pacing around the driveway as if he were waiting for something or someone. I started packing up unsold items, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. But instead of leaving, he moved closer to one of the tables near me and picked up a hammer from the tool section. He turned it over in his hands, inspecting it as though it were a rare artifact. "You still interested in that?" I asked nervously, trying to keep my tone light. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me with an unsettling intensity before finally muttering, "Maybe." As I continued packing up, I noticed that he wasn't looking at the items anymore. He was watching me. His eyes followed my every move, cold and calculating. My heart began to race as I realized how isolated we were now. Most of my neighbors had gone back inside their homes, and there were no other customers left on my driveway. "The sale's over," I said firmly, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "You should go." He didn't move. Instead, he gripped the hammer tighter and took a step closer to me. "You've got some nice stuff here," he said softly, his voice dripping with something that felt like malice. Panic set in as I backed away toward my garage door, my mind racing for an escape plan. "I said it's time for you to leave," I repeated, louder this time. That's when he lunged at me with the hammer raised high above his head. I screamed and ducked just in time as the hammer swung past me, narrowly missing my shoulder. Adrenaline surged through me as I grabbed the nearest object, a wrench from one of the tables, and swung it blindly in his direction. The metal connected with his arm with a sickening thud, causing him to drop the hammer and stumble backward with a grunt of pain. I didn't wait to see if he'd recover. I turned and bolted into my garage, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it with trembling hands. My heart pounded as I heard him banging on the door from the other side, shouting obscenities that sent chills down my spine. "Open up," he roared, his voice muffled but furious. I grabbed my phone from a nearby shelf and dialed 911 with shaking fingers while keeping my eyes fixed on the door. "There's a man trying to break into my house," I whispered frantically into the phone. The operator assured me that officers were on their way, but urged me to stay hidden until they arrived. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only minutes, the banging stopped abruptly. I held my breath as silence fell over the garage, too afraid to move or make a sound. Was he still out there? Or had he given up and left? Cautiously, I crept toward one of the small windows near the ceiling and peered outside through a crack in the blinds. The driveway was empty. When the police arrived moments later, they found no trace of him. No footprints or tire tracks leading away from my house. They took my statement and examined the hammer he had dropped during our struggle, but admitted there wasn't much they could do without more information about who he was or where he might have gone. For weeks after that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there somewhere, watching me from afar or waiting for another opportunity to strike. I stopped hosting garage sales after that incident, and even now, years later, I can't bring myself to open my garage door unless absolutely necessary. Every time I see someone walking past my house wearing a baseball cap or lingering too long near my property line, I feel that same cold knot of fear tightening in my chest all over again. And sometimes late at night when everything is quiet, I think about how close I came to becoming just another headline in tomorrow's news. Local woman attacked during garage sale, but somehow I survived. And for that, I am grateful every single day. And that's the end of these spooky garage sale true horror stories. What do you think about these stories? Let us know your opinion in the comment box below, and don't forget to subscribe to Horror Vault to keep watching our upcoming videos with such interesting content. I will see you in the next video.